Have you ever had a film buried so far in the back of your memory that seeing any imagery or descriptions of it feels almost uncanny or otherworldly? The fever dream movie is a unique category to cover, as how someone views these films can vary depending on the nostalgia they associate with it, among a lot of other factors. But not that long ago, I made a video on these particular anomalies, and it was really interesting to see not only how many resonated with the examples in the video, but also how many other movies had this effect on people that I had either never seen or just completely forgot about. However, it also provided enough variety of input to properly explore this topic even further. With that being said, let's dive into the fever dream movie effect. One of the most unanimous examples of this is The Neverending Story from 1984. Based on Michael Enda's novel of the same name, The Neverending Story is considered to be a classic 80s movie by many. It also has maintained its status as one of the weirdest cinema experiences from people's childhoods. And as someone who didn't see it as a kid, I can definitely confirm that watching it now, the dreamlike qualities that are so often attributed to the movie are very prevalent. It starts off really normal. A kid who gets bullied, doesn't like school, and has a hard time focusing. But when he finds a book and hides up in his school's attic to read it, the film abruptly transitions to some of the most uncanny, freakish visuals to come out of this era. I mean, it genuinely feels like you accidentally changed the channel. The practical effects are really good for the time, but it's the designs of the characters that are so bizarre and imaginative you can't help but feel a little tripped out. The movie also just moves from one setting to another in the blink of an eye. Where other films would have a whole journey to get somewhere, in this they say where they want to go, and in the next scene that's where they are. Exactly how events transpire when you're dreaming, and all the creatures and environments look like something you would only cook up in a dream. But in The Neverending Story, the effect is actually intentional. In the climax, the villain describes Fantasia, the place where the book is taking place, as the world of human fantasy, and how everybody there is a piece of the hopes and dreams of mankind, which is honestly a mature theme for the target audience. And there's a lot of this maturity throughout that you probably wouldn't see in a kid's movie that came out today. The protagonist gets a horse, and 5 minutes later, these darker themes, the way this thing's eyes move, this humanoid dragon dog.
That's so good.
It all adds up to a unique but heartwarming narrative with good messages of keeping imagination and hope alive. Aside from a few references to it in the modern day and a potential remake being in the works, The Neverending Story has been mostly lost with time, and it's understandable why so many had a hard time processing it as a kid. The same can be said for Mars Needs Moms, but for very different reasons. So Mars Needs Moms is a Disney movie, believe it or not, but it came out in a really weird era for the company. Obviously. See, there was another studio called Image Movers that was responsible for some hugely successful films that use motion capture animation, like The Polar Express and Monster House. Disney wanted in on this new animation wave, so they formed a joint venture with Image Movers called Image Movers Digital. The first project they did was A Christmas Carol, which did well, grossing over $100 million in profits. But after that came Mars Needs Moms in 2011, and it quickly became one of the biggest financial L's Disney's ever taken for any movie. It isn't just the fact that no one saw the movie, although that is part of it, it just doesn't have much going for it to make it memorable. For starters, the motion capture animation style of this period isn't seen much today. It absolutely looks super uncanny now, but I also think this style kind of limits how creative an animator can get with their character designs, as the models have to be something that can be captured by the movements of a human. I mean, look at E.T., Stitch, or Yoda. These are iconic alien designs that lots of people would recognize. Compare these to the boring, generic Martian design in Mars Needs Moms. Some people genuinely didn't realize it was animated when they were young, and I can only imagine how strange it is for them to see it now. There are good parts of it, and it's decently entertaining, but the theme of appreciating your family has been depicted in much more clever and engaging ways. Also, this guy was trying to tap this alien chick, and actually, can you blame him? But for real, this romance is such a weird and unnecessary thing to include, and it's so uncomfortable to watch. Anyway, combine the fact that this animation is a relic of the past with other films that look like it being much more successful, you have a movie that's almost destined to be forgotten. But one that people really wanted to forget is Help, I'm a Fish. Obscure as it may sound, it's a Danish film that's been traumatizing audiences since the release in 2000. At least that's when the original version came out. It wasn't until 2006 that it would actually be released in American theaters, making it a property that's been lost in translation, and some may have different memories of different versions. And I know this American cover doesn't look real, but trust me, it is. If you saw it at all though, I'm sure you know where this is going. To put it as simply as possible, Help I'm a Fish is about 3 kids who get turned into fish and go on a little adventure in the ocean. And pretty early on, we're met with some deeper undertones. This scientist guy wants to turn humans into fish as a result of climate change and the ice caps melting, but what's really stuck with people over the years is a scene that happens towards the end of the film, where the villain drinks this antidote that reverses the effect of the other potion, turning fish into humans. He starts to morph into this humanoid fish creature before realizing that he'll no longer be able to breathe underwater. He suffocates and his lifeless body slowly floats away. This movie's rated G, by the way. It may not seem like a tough watch now, but it's such a shift in tone that someone seeing it when they're young and impressionable is sure to leave a mark. There were also just so many fish ocean adventure movies in the 2000s that this one was just lost among them. I'm willing to bet that not a lot of people remember Toys from 1992, starring the legend himself, Robin Williams. Now there's honestly so many factors that contribute to the mystique of Toys that I don't even know where to start. Like, it could warrant a whole video in itself. But first and foremost, the movie is almost impossible to find in the US. It's not currently available on any major streaming service, so one of the only ways to actually watch it is to just order the DVD. It's one of those that perform poorly at the box office and receive generally negative reviews, so 20th Century Fox doesn't seem to think it's worth distributing. If you saw it, it was probably airing on TV at some point, or you watched a physical copy of it. It's become kind of a Mandela effect of a movie. Sure, there's the lack of availability, but it's the costume and set design that creates such a distinct atmosphere in Toys. The plot is centered around this giant toy factory where the owner dies, and instead of leaving the factory to his son, played by Robin Williams, his military general brother takes over for some reason. The general just so happens to hate fun and turns the whimsical factory into a base of operations for making weapons of war. There's clearly some political commentary and themes regarding the corruption of innocence, but there was a lot of confusion on what the film was trying to convey as a whole.
But it seems a little confused about what it's all about. If the general is in favor of war toys, is that a good reason for programming peaceful toys so they can learn to fight?
What's interesting though is that the movie is kind of ahead of its time in some ways. For example, they have these war drone piloting stations that the users think is just a simulation but ends up actually being real. And this was, before the eventual rise of drone warfare. There's solid performances across the board, especially my man LL Cool J, who puts up an Oscar-worthy performance. But at the end of the day, the actors couldn't really save the convoluted experience that is Toys. There's the lighthearted, colorful visuals and the trippy but insanely impressive set pieces, but it's all in service to convey a pretty surface level message that war is bad. Taking it for what it is though, I can always appreciate something being so different, and it's refreshing to go back and see stuff like this in an age where originality is hard to come by. Also, Robin Williams was just such a quintessential part of so many childhoods that seeing him in a more forgotten film like Toys can be kind of surreal. I feel like we also have to talk about the 2007 film Bridge to Terabithia. Now at first glance, this film just looks like your average fantasy children's book adaptation from the 2000s, and it is for the most part. It follows Jess, who's a pretty normal kid, but everyone hates him, I guess. He gets picked on and his parents kinda ignore him, but a new girl moves to town and everyone hates her too, so they become friends, and create this imaginary world called Terabithia to get lost in and forget about their problems. This fantasy world has ogres, little bug guys, and all that kind of stuff, and the CGI is pretty good for the time. None of the designs are too outlandish except for maybe this thing, but even if you did find any of the creatures a little freaky, it wasn't what left an impact. Around the third act of the film, Jess comes home to the news that his new friend Leslie passed away from falling off the rope they'd swing on to get to Terabithia. It's just out of the blue and an unexpected subject for a story like this to tackle. And for many, seeing this when they were kids provided such a palpable feeling of grief that made the movie really hard to revisit. To make matters even more depressing, it's theorized that it may not have been accidental. well, because it happened on one of the only days that Jess wasn't with her to comfort her, and she was a very troubled person in general. Again, it's not confirmed at all, it's only a theory, but yeah, really dark. And when we see movies like this at a young age, it's not always something we want to go back to, and eventually the memories of it get pushed away. But the topic was covered in a smart way for the demographic and highlighted a really positive outlook on experiencing loss. Mirrormask is one that's about as tweaked out as a movie gets. Alright, so this movie was made with the intention of paying homage to famous Jim Henson films like Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal. In fact, it was Jim's daughter, Lisa Henson, that brought the writers together for Mirrormask. If you don't know anything about Labyrinth or The Dark Crystal, they're extremely bizarre cult classics from the 80s that are often described as dreamlike. And they absolutely belong in this video, but I mainly want to look at Mirrormask. See, Labyrinth and Dark Crystal are insane, don't get me wrong. But they've garnered a decent sized following over the decades. Mirrormask is a different story. Released in 2005 and didn't even break $1 million at the box office. It follows a girl named Helena whose parents run a circus. One day she gets in a fight with her mom and wishes she was dead, but tragically the wish comes true, and she has to do whatever it takes to get her mom back. And I gotta say, even before the setting switches to this other dimension, the circus setting it starts out in is pretty unsettling. But it's after she gets transported that things get real crazy. The atmosphere is so intentionally hazy that calling it a fever dream is honestly a compliment. But I mean, every interaction just feels so off.
Shall not pass.
I bet I shall.
Riddle.
Riddle.
Answer my riddle, and only then you can pass. Fail, and I devour you. Bones and all.
The effects are dated, but it has that 2000s charm to it. I mean, look at these things. What am I even looking at? From the music to the art style, it all feels like you're in someone's acid nightmare that you're not supposed to be seeing. Because of how little it's talked about now, people who saw it thought it was some kind of hallucination. The 2010s clearly saw some pretty wacky animated releases, right? We brushed over that with Mars Needs Moms. By this point, most of the industry had fully transitioned to CGI 3D animation, and studios had to get with the times. But some other examples would include Epic, Box Trolls, or Rango to name a few. One that kind of stands in its own distinct lane though is Legend of the Guardians Owls of Ga'Hoole. Right out the gate, let's just all agree that this title sucks ass, and it probably contributed more to it being forgettable than anyone would like to admit. In 2010, Warner Bros. Wanted another Happy Feet kind of success in a CG animated bird movie, so they adapted the Guardians of Ga'Hoole book series into a film. See, the books have better titles. Now, these owls are not just regular owls you'd find in nature, they're a sophisticated society of medieval night owls. So I guess they thought it was fitting to bring in Zack Snyder to direct it. The movie isn't bad, but there's a few things that make it stand out. For starters, it's stylistically different from most titles from this era. The visuals are still very good to this day, it holds up well, and one of the main goals was to make it look like it was being shot in live action all the way through. The animators tested out actual film equipment to understand the limitations of a camera and give the movie a more authentic vibe, which paid off. It really feels like there's a camera following these owls throughout. Additionally, the style of these environments and the way everything's lit gives it this cool ambience that looks like a painting, but also kind of looks like you're staring into a memory. The subject matter is a little dark, but nothing too crazy. There's a religious cult that's brainwashing owls and turning them into zombie-like followers, and some did find the violence and captivity showcased to be a little disturbing when they were young. It wasn't a commercial failure by any means, but there's a reason why something like Happy Feet did so much better. The characters. Owls are inherently kind of creepy and gross. I mean, there's a way to make it work. Pixar literally made rats into a compelling kids movie, but in general, something like penguins are much cuter and easy to market. But how many of you have seen or heard of Warriors of Virtue? If you said no, you're lucky. It's a 1997 martial arts fantasy film featuring anthropomorphic kangaroo warriors. It was made by 4 Chinese American brothers who were doctors at the time, but their father, who was a successful toy manufacturer, provided most of the budget to make it happen. It was in an effort to turn the Warriors of Virtue into a household name and successful toy line like Ninja Turtles or Power Rangers, and I simply have no idea how it could have possibly failed. In all seriousness, this movie looks ridiculous and is very evidently a ripoff of better properties, but once you realize that logic is completely out the window, watching it now, it's pretty hilarious.
This is our home. We want it back.
Warriors, come out and play!
At least Kangaroo Jack actually looked like a kangaroo. The absurd designs of the kangaroo ninjas paired with the over-the-top special effects while they do kung fu makes for such an unhinged ride. They repeat this catchphrase of "virtue be yours," and I guess they thought it was going to be an iconic, memorable line like it's morphin' time.
Virtue be yours!
And some of it is straight nightmare fuel.
There was always wisdom in your heart. Welcome home.
Like, why does this one sound like that? Imagine seeing something that looked like this in real life and it opens its mouth to start talking like Batman. It'd be terrifying. Now, the 5 main kangaroos get their name Warriors of Virtue because they represent the virtues of loyalty, wisdom, integrity, righteousness, and benevolence. But there's not much distinction in their personalities compared to something like Ninja Turtles, except for this guy who's mute and clangs his armor around to communicate. All in all, it doesn't take a genius to see why this movie was forgotten. While we're on the topic of wild Chinese films marketed to American audiences, I should probably mention The Secret of the Magic Gourd. Somehow, The Secret of the Magic Gourd is another Disney movie, and showing you this poster is all I should really have to do to explain this inclusion. So I guess this was initially just a project from the Centro Studio out of Hong Kong, but Disney was probably offered a massive check to release it in the US. And let me just say, the dub is terrible. Disney's one job was to dub the film, and none of the actors here are trying, except for the Gourd, who was voiced by the guy from High School Musical. The egregious acting makes all the dialogue so unnatural, but yeah, it's the CGI Gourd doing crazy magic that really threw everybody off. The Gourd in the movie can grant wishes, so it does stuff like levitate fish, bring toys to life, and clean rooms. It was released as a made-for-television movie, and no one ever talks about it nowadays because, well, everyone who saw it was either put off by it or just forgot about it entirely. I remember watching a live-action film on Disney Channel when I was younger. It was about a boy named Raymond, or Ray, I forgot, who is friends with an anthropomorphic gourd, or maybe something that looks like a gourd, I don't know. I forgot the name of the gourd, but the closest I could recall is Bailey or something, and it's also brown in color. It's based on a traditional Chinese story about a gourd that can grant wishes, and it's supposed to teach the values of hard work. Gourds are also just generally symbolic of good fortune and productivity in Chinese culture. So I'm sure it was marginally less confusing for those watching it in China, but it raises the question of why did Disney agree to market it in America?
I guess we'll never know.
The last movie I want to look at is kind of a special one, and that is Shorts. So my personal experience with this is that I had seen at least part of it on TV at some point. I don't know when. I very well could have been a teenager when I saw it, and it completely slipped my mind, but all I remembered from the film was a booger monster. And for years I'd think to myself, what was that movie with the big-ass green snot monster? I finally learned that the memory was from Shorts, and I was gonna talk about the movie last time, but I just figured it was too obscure and personal to even bring it up, but I was extremely surprised to see multiple mentions of it in the comments. Like, it honestly blew my mind. Anyway, Shorts is made by Troublemaker Studios, and if you recognize this little guy in the logo, it's because they're the same company that made the Spy Kids movies. Now, Spy Kids was never a cinematic masterpiece franchise, but they're looked back on pretty fondly because they've kind of become staples of the early 2000s. They fell into that same very niche subgenre of like Shark Boy and Lava Girl, which was also made by Troublemaker. Just awful effects, over-the-top acting, and cartoonish characters, but it's got that campy charm I was talking about earlier. Shorts came out in 2009, 6 years after the third Spy Kids, and it was still trying to do more of the same. And by this point, the demand for this kind of movie had completely fizzled out. Those films also just had more engaging plots than Shorts. Some crazy events unfold in this, but the kid who's narrating has forgotten the order in which everything takes place because a magic rock is messing up his brainwaves. So the movie's plot is shown in these disjointed segments. That's why it's called Shorts. But as you can imagine, it makes this already unremarkable story that much more disorienting. And now I absolutely get why so many, myself included, had a weird memory of it. Now, looking at all these films I've covered, or even the personal examples you may have in your head right now, it begs the question, what makes something fit into this category? And while there's not a simple, definitive answer, because, well, memory is a wild thing, there are some noteworthy parallels. A common theme you might have noticed is that a lot of these feature darker subject matter despite seemingly being aimed at younger audiences. Sure, a depressing movie can be entertaining, some of the best movies are, but the fact is, it's human nature, especially when you're young, to be avoidant of stuff that makes you feel depressed or frightened, or any negative emotion for that matter. So when you see one of these and it leaves a sour taste in your mouth, it usually doesn't end up being one of those childhood movies you watch on repeat. Also, many of these may not have done well financially and caused them to not be relevant today. Spy Kids, like I mentioned a bit ago, is one that has a lot of the traits that these movies do, but it's maintained a lot more relevance in pop culture and is still referenced often today. Same can be said for Coraline. It's an animated nightmare for sure, but it's talked about enough today that it's a little harder to forget. Most of these have been left in the past to some degree. And then there's the obvious reason: vividly bizarre and uncanny visuals. So many of these have pretty normal characters and seem like they're going to be inoffensive, kid-friendly movies, but end up featuring some unsettling or psychedelic imagery. Sometimes it does stick with you, but other times all you're left with is a faint recollection of what you thought you saw. But I also want to mention that these kinds of movies aren't really made today. Sure, there's releases that look bad, but in general, decent equipment and good animation has become much more accessible and cheap, to the point where the next generations probably won't see a lot of the stuff that scarred us growing up. I mean, would they make Country Bears today? No. It's a little sad because there is a lot of artistic expression in these, but maybe not seeing something like this at a young age is good. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed this video and thanks for sticking around. I'm curious to hear thoughts and experiences with these films, as well as any that made you feel a similar way. See ya.